I mean, here in the United States, when the term fascist gets used, it's either talking about stuff in other countries, it's talking about ancient history, or it's used as a sort of insult, right? A sort of generic right-wing epithet that people use to criticize politicians who are at most on the edge of mainstream American political thought. But now, with the Republican Party's presidential frontrunner proposing that all Muslims should be banned from entering the United States, that perhaps there ought to be a national registry of Muslims, that we ought to look into Muslims having to carry government ID cards that state their religion. Now, the word fascist is being used to describe this ascending and leading Republican politician. But the word is not being used casually, it's not being used just as an insult from the left. Now that word, that incredibly loaded word that we do not associate with real American politics, it is being used by other conservatives, by other Republicans to talk about Donald Trump. Jeb Bush National Security Advisor John Noonan, quote, "Forced federal registration of U.S. citizens based on religious identity is fascism, period. Nothing else to call it." He misspells fascism, but I think I know what he means. Max Boot is a very well-known right-wing national security guy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Quote, "Trump is a fascist, and that's not a term I use loosely or often, but he has earned it." There's been actually enough of this recently that CNN recently ran a sort of roundup article on why some conservatives say that Trump talk is fascist. Their roundup included this tweet from Iowa Republican radio host, very influential guy in the Iowa Republican caucuses, Steve Deese. Quote, "If Obama proposed the same religion registry as Trump, every conservative in the country would call it what it is, creeping fascism." One of the New York Times' resident conservatives published this last week. Is Donald Trump a fascist? The answer, yes. In perfect New York Times understated style, quote, "Trump may indeed be a little fascistic." The Times columnist who wrote that last week, I think, seemed to have spooked himself a little bit about having said that out loud. He wrote that last week, and then on Monday he published another column basically rolling back the thesis a little bit. But then several hours later, Donald Trump announced his "no Muslims are allowed to come to the United States" plan, and that led to one of the greatest tweets of all time from that New York Times columnist, quote, "Okay, I concede I picked the wrong day to modestly walk back my Trumpism as fascism column." Oh, did he just... Okay, well, I guess I was right the first time. And again, this fascism allegation, this is not coming from the left. This is coming from the right. It's coming from inside the Republican Party and from within mainstream conservative thought. And now it's on the front pages of mainstream American newspapers like this from the Philadelphia Daily News today. But fascism is not just a word. It's not just a way to insult someone with whom you disagree. It is a specific thing. It is a specific form of far-right politics that involves a sort of narcissistic cult of Superman action around the leader of the party. Fascist political gatherings tend to encourage or at least expect a little violence around the edges, particularly against counter-protesters. Fascistic leaders are aggressively macho and chauvinistic. They are xenophobic about people who they portray as outsiders or some sort of threat to the nation or as weaklings they can denounce. They brook no dissent. They are completely intolerant of criticism. And when it comes to policy proposals and governing philosophy, they are not known for nuance. The great leader just gets it done because the great leader is great and great men do great things. Trust in the great leader. I mean, that's basically a fourth grader's definition of fascism, right? It's not the most nuanced portrayal of what this is political science, but that's basically what it is. It is a real political organizing principle that has been the founding principle of modern political movements in other countries, but not usually in ours. Other countries have grappled with this since World War II and in modern times, including France grappling with it now. But now here in this country, it's not just critical observers and liberals and journalists who are calling this moment in Republican politics a flirtation with fascism in this country or a manifestation of fascist political movement in this country. Now that assessment is even coming from within the Republican Party itself. Watching the Republican Party come to terms with that among themselves is part of what we're going to be talking about in tonight's show, including the question of whether or not Mr. Trump is setting himself up to be potentially expelled from the party, whether he's trying to get himself kicked out or whether they're going to keep him within the party and thereby normalize these kinds of ideas. But now to the rest of us who are somehow involved in or at least watching this political process. For those of us who are voters and those of us who are in the press and who write about and explain this stuff for a living. For the Democrats who are setting themselves up to run against whoever the Republican nominee nominates by this process that right now has Donald Trump leading by a prohibitive margin. We all now have to decide whether we're comfortable using this word. Whether fascism as a word is too over the top to use in this context of our politics right now in our country, or whether it helps because it's accurate to basically describe this as America's Sir Oswald Mosley moment. Democratic presidential candidate Martin O'Malley committed himself on this subject already. He tweeted, Donald Trump has, quote, removed all doubt. He is running for president as a fascist demagogue. As a fascist demagogue.